It is the afternoon of January 9th, 2007. Nokia's co-chief executive Anzi Vanjoki is sitting in his office in Espoo, Finland, watching a live stream of an event unfolding 11 time zones away in San Francisco. On a stage at the Moscone Center, Steve Jobs is holding up a small black rectangle. An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator, Jobs says. These are not three separate devices. This is one device. The audience erupts. Vanjoki watches the screen. He is not panicking. Nokia's leadership team had watched similar demonstrations before from Sony, from Motorola, from a dozen other companies that had tried and failed to dislodge them. They had heard the word revolutionary attached to phones that turned out to be irrelevant. The iPhone, they believed, was just another one of those. Within 48 hours, Nokia's internal communications team issued an assessment of the iPhone. It was circulated to senior leadership across the company's Espoo campus. The assessment concluded that the iPhone was an interesting consumer product, but posed no strategic threat to Nokia's core business. The battery life was too short. The price was too high. The keyboard was too difficult to use. Apple had no experience in mobile telecommunications. It would struggle to build the carrier relationships that Nokia had spent 2 decades cultivating. That assessment, circulated in a glass and concrete office park in southern Finland on January 11, 2007, was the moment Nokia surrendered the phone market it had built from nothing. The company did not know that yet. It would take 5 years to find out. You would not know any of that from looking at Nokia in January 2007. Nokia in January 2007 was not a company in trouble. Nokia in January 2007 was the most dominant consumer electronics company on Earth. Nokia controlled 40% of the global mobile phone market. Not 40% of smartphones, 40% of every mobile phone sold anywhere in the world. In some markets, the number was higher. In China, Nokia held nearly 60%. In India, it was the first phone millions of people had ever owned. In Africa, Nokia handsets were so ubiquitous they had become a synonym for mobile phone itself. People in rural Kenya and Tanzania asked not for a phone, but for a Nokia. The company's revenue in 2007 was 51.1 billion euros. Its operating profit was 7.8 billion euros. It employed more than 112,000 people across research facilities, manufacturing plants, and sales offices in 120 countries. Its supply chain was the most sophisticated in the mobile industry. Nokia had mastered the logistics of producing hundreds of millions of inexpensive, durable handsets and distributing them to every corner of the planet at a cost and speed that no competitor had ever matched. The Nokia brand had been ranked by Interbrand as the 5th most valuable brand in the world in 2000, ahead of Mercedes-Benz, Marlboro, and American Express. In Finland, Nokia was not merely a company, it was a national institution. At its peak, Nokia accounted for approximately 4% of Finland's entire gross domestic product and more than 20% of the country's total exports. But the number that mattered most was this. Between 1998 and 2007, Nokia had shipped more than 1.5 billion mobile phones, 1.5 billion devices, held, carried, worn out, and replaced by people on every continent, in every income bracket, in every language. To understand how a company that dominant could lose everything within 6 years, you have to understand what Nokia actually was, and what kind of trap that dominance had quietly built around it. To find out, we have to go back to the beginning. Nokia, Finland, 1865. The company that would one day sell phones to half the world began as a paper mill. Fredrik Idestam was a 26-year-old Finnish mining engineer who had studied in Germany and come home with a new process for manufacturing paper pulp from wood rather than rags. In 1865, he built a mill on the banks of the Nokianvirta River in southwestern Finland, a fast-moving river whose hydroelectric potential could power the machinery he needed. He called the company Nokia AB after the river. For the next 100 years, Nokia was a conglomerate that had almost nothing to do with technology. It made paper. Then it made rubber boots and tires, acquiring the Finnish Rubber Works in 1922. Then it made cables and electronics, acquiring the Finnish Cable Works in 1967. By the 1960s, Nokia AB had become Nokia Corporation. a sprawling industrial group producing rubber galoshes, toilet paper, industrial cables, and, almost as an afterthought, electronics components. The transformation from rubber boots to mobile phones was not a stroke of visionary genius. It was an act of survival. In the late 1980s, Nokia was in serious financial trouble. The company had diversified recklessly into consumer electronics, televisions, computers, car stereos, and the results were catastrophic. By 1988, Nokia was losing money on its electronics business. Its television division alone was generating losses that threatened the entire group. The company's chief executive, Kari Kairamo, died by suicide in December 1988 under the pressure of managing a company that seemed to be spinning apart. The new leadership team, led by Jorma Ollila, a 39-year-old economist who had run Nokia's mobile phone division, made a decision in 1992 that would redefine not just Nokia, but the entire global technology industry. Ollila decided to sell every division of Nokia that was not telecommunications. The paper mills, the rubber factories, the television plants, all of it. Nokia would become a pure mobile phone company. It was a bet that required extraordinary nerve, because in 1992, the mobile phone market barely existed. There were fewer than 10 million mobile phone subscribers in the entire world. The devices were the size of bricks and cost more than a used car. Nokia's own 1011 model, released that year, weighed 475 grams and retailed for approximately $2,000 in today's money. Nobody watching Nokia in 1992 would have predicted it would become the most important consumer electronics company of the next decade. But Ollila understood something about what mobile phones were going to become that almost nobody else did. He understood that the phone was not a device for business people making calls from airports. It was going to be a personal object, something people would carry everywhere, use constantly, and feel attached to in the way they felt attached to a wristwatch or a wallet. And personal objects, Ollila believed, needed to be designed and marketed the way personal objects were designed and marketed, not as engineering products, as cultural ones. Nokia's 3210, released in 1999, was the proof. It was the first Nokia phone without an external antenna, smooth, rounded, designed to fit in a pocket or a hand. It came in interchangeable colored shells, blue, yellow, silver, red, that let teenagers express themselves through their phone the way they express themselves through their clothes. The 3210 sold 130 million units. It became the defining object of an entire generation's adolescence across Europe, Asia, and Latin America. And then Nokia kept going. The 3310, released in 2000, sold another 126 million units. The 1100, released in 2003 as an entry-level device for emerging markets, became the best-selling consumer electronics product in history. More than 250 million units sold. Each generation of Nokia phone reached more people in more places than the last. By 2003, Nokia had built something that no company had built before in any consumer category. A truly global brand that meant the same thing in Helsinki and Nairobi and Shanghai and Sao Paulo. The phone. Not a phone. The phone. That was the height. And it was from that height that the fall began. Not with a single decision, but with a structural trap that Nokia had been building around itself for years without fully recognizing what it was building. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what Nokia's business actually was in 2003 and 2004. Nokia's business was not design, it was not software, it was not innovation. Nokia's actual business, the engine of its €7.8 billion operating profit, was hardware volume at scale. Nokia had spent 15 years perfecting the manufacture and distribution of physical phones. It had built factories in 5 countries. It had supplier relationships with hundreds of component manufacturers. It had logistics infrastructure that could move 300 million devices a year from factory floor to retail shelf in 150 countries. It had carrier relationships. The agreements with Vodafone, Deutsche Telekom, China Mobile, and every other major network operator. That took decades to build and gave Nokia preferential shelf placement in every carrier store in the world. This hardware infrastructure was Nokia's real competitive advantage, not its design, not its software, its ability to manufacture at scale, distribute globally, and work within the carrier ecosystem better than anyone else. Here is the trap inside that advantage. Everything about Nokia's organizational structure, its incentive system, and its culture was built to serve that hardware business. The engineers who got promoted were hardware engineers. The metrics that mattered were unit volume and bill of materials cost. The carrier relationships that Nokia protected above everything else were carrier relationships built around selling subsidized hardware, not software platforms. And in 2004, Nokia built something that should have freed it from that trap. Something that, if Nokia had understood what it was holding, might have changed everything. In 2004, Nokia's research division completed development of a working touchscreen smartphone prototype. The device had a large touchscreen display. It ran a version of Nokia's Symbian operating system with a touchscreen interface. It had internet connectivity, an application platform, and the ability to install third-party software. Nokia's engineers called it a breakthrough. The project lead described it internally as the future of the smartphone. It was 3 years before the iPhone. Nokia did not cancel the project. What Nokia did was something more consequential than cancellation. It deprioritized it. The touchscreen prototype was handed to a product committee. The committee evaluated it against Nokia's existing product roadmap. The committee asked a series of entirely rational questions. How much would the touchscreen components add to the bill of materials? How would the device fit into the carrier subsidy structures that Nokia's existing phones relied on? Would consumers really prefer a touchscreen to a physical keyboard, which Nokia's research showed they consistently said they preferred in surveys? The touchscreen prototype did not fit Nokia's existing answers to those questions. The components were expensive. The carrier subsidy model was unclear. The keyboard surveys were negative. The project moved to a lower priority tier. It was not the future Nokia was building toward. This is the part that most people miss about what happened to Nokia. The decision to deprioritize the touchscreen prototype was not made by fools. It was made by extremely competent people applying extremely competent analysis to the wrong question. They asked, does this product fit our current business? They should have asked, does this product define the next business? Those are different questions. Nokia had spent 15 years building a system that was extraordinarily good at answering the first one. It had no mechanism for taking the second one seriously. The organizational structure reinforced this blind spot at every level. Nokia in 2004 was organized into two main divisions: the mobile phones division, which made the mass-market handsets, and the multimedia division, which was supposed to develop smartphone and internet devices. On paper, this looked like Nokia hedging its bets. In practice, the mobile phones division generated 80% of Nokia's revenue and commanded the vast majority of the company's executive attention, engineering talent, and capital allocation. The multimedia division operated in its shadow. When a conflict arose between what the multimedia division wanted to build and what the mobile phones division needed to protect, the mobile phones division won. Every time. There was a second trap built into Nokia's organizational culture that compounded the first. Nokia's senior leadership team operated in a climate of internal fear that was documented in detail by researchers who interviewed Nokia executives in 2010 for an academic study at INSEAD. Middle managers, the study found, were deeply reluctant to deliver bad news upward. When projects ran into problems, the problems were minimized or reframed in reports to senior leadership. When external threats appeared on the horizon, and several Nokia engineers raised specific concerns about Apple's rumored phone project as early as 2006, those concerns moved slowly through the hierarchy, losing urgency at each level, until they reached the top in diluted form. The culture that had made Nokia so effective at operational execution, its discipline, its hierarchy, its focus on meeting commitments, made it structurally blind to disruptive threats. Nokia's engineers knew. Nokia's middle managers knew. The information did not reach the people who could have acted on it in a form that demanded action. The INSEAD study, published in 2010 and based on 76 interviews with Nokia executives and engineers conducted between 2008 and 2009, used a specific phrase to describe Nokia's internal dynamic: leadership-induced fear. Senior executives, the study found, projected overconfidence in public statements and in internal communications. That overconfidence created pressure on middle managers to match it. A middle manager who arrived at a senior review meeting with genuinely alarming news about a competitor was implicitly signaling that the senior leadership's public confidence had been misplaced. The social cost of delivering that message was high. The social cost of softening it was low, and so messages were softened, consistently at every level for years. The same engineers who had built the 2004 touchscreen prototype were, by 2006, watching Apple's rumored phone project with growing alarm. Several of them raised their concerns formally through Nokia's internal reporting structures. One senior engineer filed a written assessment in early 2006, noting that Apple's entry into the phone market would likely accelerate the transition to software-defined value in mobile devices, a transition for which Nokia's Symbian platform was structurally unprepared. The assessment was acknowledged. It did not change any allocation of resources, any product priority, or any organizational decision. And so by late 2006, Nokia had a hardware organization of extraordinary scale and capability, a software platform that was aging and fragmented, an internal culture that systematically filtered out bad news, and a leadership team that had read the January 11th assessment and believed it. Here is where the story takes a turn. Nokia understood, at least intellectually, that software was going to matter more as phones became more capable. They had been developing Symbian, their smartphone operating system, since 1998 through a joint venture with Ericsson, Motorola, and Xeon. By 2004, Symbian was running on tens of millions of Nokia smartphones. On paper, Nokia had a mobile operating system and a head start. In practice, Symbian was a disaster. Symbian had been designed in the late 1990s for devices with very limited memory and very limited processing power. Its architecture reflected those constraints. Developers who tried to build applications for Symbian described the experience as writing code with one hand tied behind their back. The documentation was incomplete. The development tools were archaic. The process of getting an application certified and distributed through Nokia's ecosystem required navigating a bureaucratic approval process that could take months. The Android developer experience, when it arrived in 2008, made Symbian look like it had been designed by people who had never thought about developers at all, because it essentially had been. Nokia knew Symbian was a problem. As early as 2005, Nokia's own software engineers were telling leadership that the operating system was approaching the limits of what it could be made to do. The problem was not abstract. It was specific, documented, and worsening every year. Symbian's architecture required developers to write code in a dialect of C++ that was so unusual it had no real analog in any other software environment. Variables had to be manually managed in ways that modern development frameworks had eliminated. Functions that took a developer 1 hour to build on other platforms took a week on Symbian. Memory management, a task that iOS and Android handled automatically, had to be performed manually on Symbian, and a single error in that process could crash the entire device. Nokia ran training courses for developers to try to reduce the dropout rate. The dropout rate remained high. By 2007, Nokia was aware that developer experience on Symbian was a competitive liability. It commissioned multiple internal reviews. Each review concluded the same thing. Symbian could be patched and extended, but could not be fundamentally rebuilt without disrupting the entire ecosystem that depended on it. Nokia had 50 million Symbian-based phones in use around the world. Rewriting the operating system from scratch would strand every one of them. The multimedia division had begun experimenting with a new operating system called Maemo, a Linux-based platform that ran on Nokia's N800 Internet tablet, released in 2007. Maemo was modern, capable, and genuinely impressive. Developers who worked with it called it years ahead of Symbian. Nokia shipped the N800 as a standalone device. It was not a phone. It ran on Wi-Fi, not the cellular network. Nokia's leadership had decided that putting Maemo on a phone was too risky. The platform was not stable enough. The carrier relationships were complicated, and the transition would require retraining Nokia's entire developer ecosystem. Symbian would remain the phone operating system. Maemo would remain a side project for tablet-like devices that sold in the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds of millions. The iPhone arrived running a mobile version of OS X, a mature, modern operating system with a full application programming interface. a clean development environment, and the backing of Apple's existing developer community. Within a year, the App Store had launched. Within 2 years, it contained 65,000 applications. Within 3 years, it had passed 100,000. Nokia's Obi Store, its answer to the App Store, launched in May 2009, 2 full years after the iPhone. On launch day, the store crashed within hours under the load of users trying to access it. When it was finally operational, it contained a fraction of the applications available on iOS and Android. The checkout process required users to enter their credit card details on a website rather than through the device. Nokia's own engineers publicly described it as not ready. But it gets worse. In 2008, Nokia acquired Navtech, the mapping and navigation data company, for $8.1 billion. It was the largest acquisition in Nokia's history. The strategic logic was sound. Maps and location data would be critical to the next generation of smartphones. Nokia paid $8.1 billion to own the best map data in the world. Google Maps was free. In September 2010, Nokia appointed Stephen Elop as its new chief executive officer. Elop was a Canadian technology executive who had come from Microsoft, where he had run the business division. He was the first non-Finnish CEO in Nokia's 145-year history. His appointment was a signal. Though not everyone read it correctly, Nokia's board had concluded that the people who had built the company could not be the ones to save it. Elop spent his first months at Nokia conducting an internal review. What he found was a company that had spent the previous 3 years in a state of managed denial, running pilots, forming committees, and issuing strategy documents while its market share collapsed in the one segment that was growing. Nokia's global phone market share was still near 40% in 2010, but that number was masking a catastrophe. In smartphones specifically, Nokia's market share had fallen from 50% in 2007 to under 30%. Android was growing at 900% year-over-year. iOS was growing at 90% year-over-year. Nokia's smartphone platform was not growing at all. On February 8, 2011, Elop sent a memo to Nokia's entire workforce. The memo became one of the most quoted internal documents in business history. It began, "There is a burning platform, and we must decide how we are going to change our behavior." Elop described a man standing on an oil platform engulfed in flames, facing a choice between certain death and a jump into the cold North Sea. "We too are standing on a burning platform," he wrote, "and we must decide how we are going to change our behavior." The memo detailed exactly how far Nokia had fallen. It named Android and iOS by name. It described Nokia's software platform as a fire trap. It was remarkable for its honesty and devastating for what it implied. The CEO of Nokia had concluded that the company's core product platform was unfixable. 3 days later, on February 11, 2011, Nokia announced a strategic partnership with Microsoft. Nokia would abandon its own smartphone operating systems, both Symbian and the more promising MeeGo, the successor to Maemo, and build its future smartphones on Windows Phone. The decision was received with disbelief by Nokia's engineering teams in Finland. Hundreds of engineers who had spent years building MeeGo, the Linux-based platform that many believed was technically superior to both iOS and Android, received the news on the same day as the public announcement. Several left the company within weeks. A group of former Nokia engineers would go on to found Oya, a company that continued developing MeeGo's successor, shipping a device in 2013 that received enthusiastic reviews and went nowhere commercially. The talent that might have saved Nokia had been building the right thing. Nokia had not let them ship it. The Windows Phone partnership was not irrational on its face. Microsoft had deep carrier relationships, a developer community, and a genuine interest in competing with Apple and Google. But it put Nokia in a position it had never been in before. Dependent on a platform, it did not control competing with Android manufacturers who had no such dependency, and rebuilding its smartphone business from zero market share in the segment that was replacing every segment it had owned. The Lumia line of Windows Phone devices, launched in late 2011, received strong reviews. The hardware was well designed. The Lumia 920, released in 2012, was widely regarded as the best-built smartphone of its year. It made no difference. Windows Phone's market share never exceeded 3%. Developers did not build for a platform with 3% market share. Users did not buy phones without applications. The circle closed on itself and never opened. Nokia's mobile phone market share, which had been 40% in 2007, fell to 15% by 2012. Its smartphone market share was below 5%. In September 2013, Microsoft announced the acquisition of Nokia's devices and services business for $7.2 billion. The same Nokia that had been valued at over $100 billion at its peak. The company whose brand had been ranked fifth most valuable in the world, sold its phone business for $7.2 billion. Stephen Elop, who had come from Microsoft to run Nokia, returned to Microsoft as part of the deal. The acquisition was widely described in the Finnish press as a national tragedy. Microsoft wrote down $7.6 billion on the Nokia acquisition in 2015, more than the entire purchase price, and laid off 18,000 Nokia employees. The write-down was the largest in Microsoft's history. It acknowledged, in accounting terms, that the Nokia phone business had been worth effectively nothing. What followed was a series of attempts to find a new shape for a company that no longer had its reason for existing. The Nokia that Microsoft did not acquire retained its network infrastructure business, its mapping business, and its patents. The network infrastructure business. Nokia Solutions and Networks merged with Alcatel-Lucent in 2016 to form Nokia Networks, which today is one of the three largest suppliers of mobile telecommunications equipment in the world, competing with Ericsson and Huawei. The mapping business, HERE, was sold to a consortium of German automakers, Volkswagen, BMW, and Daimler, in 2015 for $2.8 billion. In 2016, Nokia licensed its brand to a Finnish company called HMD Global, which began manufacturing Nokia-branded Android phones. These phones are made in China, sold primarily in emerging markets, and have no meaningful connection to the Nokia that once defined the mobile phone industry. The brand is a label on commodity hardware. It is not the company. Nokia's patent portfolio, assembled over 30 years of genuine technical innovation, became one of its most valuable assets in its reduced form. Nokia collected billions in patent licensing fees from Apple, Samsung, and other smartphone manufacturers, including Apple, which settled a patent dispute with Nokia in 2017 for an undisclosed sum estimated at over $2 billion. The company that had invented technology that Apple was now paying to license no longer made the devices that used it. There is a detail about Nokia's Espoo campus that is worth noting. The headquarters building, which Nokia built at the height of its dominance, is one of the most striking corporate buildings in Northern Europe, a curved glass structure on the shore of the Gulf of Finland. Designed to reflect the company's belief in its own permanence, Nokia still occupies part of that building. The rest has been converted into a technology campus that houses dozens of the startups founded by former Nokia engineers after the collapse. The people who understood what Nokia should have been building found somewhere else to build it. Today, Nokia still exists as a telecommunications network equipment company headquartered in Espoo, Finland. Its networks division employs approximately 89,000 people across 130 countries. At its peak in 2000, the broader Nokia group employed more than 112,000 people, and its market capitalization exceeded $250 billion. Nokia no longer makes consumer devices in any meaningful sense. The phones that carry its name are manufactured and sold by HMD Global under a licensing agreement. The operating systems that Nokia spent a decade trying to build, Symbian, Maemo, Migo, are gone. The carrier relationships that Nokia spent 20 years cultivating, which its leadership believed were the company's most defensible competitive advantage, turned out to be worthless the moment carriers decided to carry iPhones. The touchscreen smartphone prototype that Nokia's engineers completed in 2004 was never shipped as a consumer product. The engineers who built it moved on. The platform they were beginning to develop was abandoned. 3 years later, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and showed the world exactly what Nokia had been holding in its hands and sat down. Nokia knew. That is the thing that is hardest to sit with. Nokia knew. Its engineers had built the device. Its researchers had written the reports. Its middle managers had raised the concerns. The knowledge existed inside the company. It moved through the organization, lost urgency at each level, and arrived at the top in the form of an internal assessment that concluded the iPhone posed no strategic threat. The lesson people draw from Nokia is usually about innovation, about the need to disrupt yourself before someone else does it. But that is not quite right, because Nokia was trying to disrupt itself. The engineers were building the right things. The problem was not a failure to innovate. The problem was an organizational structure that could not translate innovation into decision-making, a culture that filtered out bad news before it reached the people who needed to hear it, a set of metrics and incentives so perfectly calibrated to the existing business that they made every alternative look irrational. Nokia did not fail to see the future. Nokia failed to build a system that could act on what it saw. That is a different kind of failure, and it is harder to fix because it does not announce itself. It looks like competence. It looks like discipline. It looks, from the inside, like a very well-run company making very sensible decisions. Until it doesn't.